Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. Just to tell you a little bit more about myself, and as maybe the initial slide indicates, I'm a professor at the University of Colorado, currently our department chair in the Environmental Studies program. And I'm a fellow at the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences, and that is a large research institute that is roughly 900 largely natural physical scientists that also include several members of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So that's a little bit about myself. It's a wonderful honor to spend this time with you. I understand that time is short, and so I've abbreviated my comments to fit, but clearly I am happy to continue this conversation. And it is an honor to follow Lena. I think her comments were heartfelt and really productive in this ongoing set of presentations and discussions that we've had over the last 2 days. You know, I want to start just by acknowledging that the way in which this was constructed, thank you to Professor Justin Farrell around truth and post-truth in communication, media, and society. The way in which I'm approaching this is through a case study of climate change. And the reason that I'm approaching it in this way, this has come up quite a lot, but it is a threat multiplier. It is woven through many critical issues like public health, food, foreign policy, poverty, immigration, et cetera, et cetera. And even though we are extremely privileged to be sitting at this table with many of you here today, I think many of us still feel very powerless, that many of us still feel as though while we have gained great insights through the work that we do, we still recognize that the scale of our actions are still nowhere near the scale of what's needed. And so that's the importance of pointing to collective action. And a consequence of our shared behaviors is this intersectional set of challenges around climate change. It cuts to the heart of how we live, work, play, relax, pray in society. And so this necessitates our commitment to working to find common ground across a political spectrum, different areas of religion, through culture and society. And so what I'm going to do in the next few minutes that I've got is to talk a little bit through a book that I wrote a few years ago, which is the title of this talk, Creative Climate Communications. But I want to focus in on how there have been narratives constructed around advocacy, which is chapter 6 of my book, if you end up picking it up, and how this notion of advocacy has been denigrated at times, but how it's woven its way into culture, ideology, politics, and society as it relates to engagement, productive engagement in climate science, policy, and society. And then I'll make a few linkages to climate change temporality and action, how this is playing out through generational engagement. And just to take a half step to the side there, I want to recognize, as I think we all know well, that we're in a moment right here, sitting in this beautiful space where carbon dioxide emissions, where methane emissions are higher than they've been in 800,000 years. 50% higher than since the Industrial Revolution. In terms of the 7 warmest years in recorded history over the last 140 plus years of recorded history, the last 7 have been these last 7 years of our lives. 19 of the 20 warmest years on record have taken place since 2000. We are part of the warmest decade. The superlatives, the tragic superlatives continue on and on and on through sea level rise, through a variety of other ways in which we feel this, not just through our scientific findings, but viscerally, experientially, emotionally, and so forth. So while I say that, one of the challenges that I think that we all encounter is that because this has become such an increasingly politicized set of challenges that get to post-truth, that get to these considerations that we've been talking about today, we've often foreclosed on pathways to action, that we've retreated to our comfort zones, and some of the things that I've already mentioned before about our spaces through the research that we do have cut off in certain ways important experiential, tactile, tangible, affective, aesthetic ways of knowing about and learning about a changing climate. And so the dominant way of knowing, and I won't dwell here too long, because we've talked a little bit about it, through the information deficit model. There's a bevy of international reports. I will reveal to you all that while I haven't worked on the most recent first working group report of the IPCC. I am a contributing author to the third working group. And so I'm a part of this process of the production of science to better understand the world around us. And I had mentioned earlier just this notion from Brian Wynn, the deficit model is dead, but long live the deficit model. And in a way, you know, we can think about this when Charles VI had died and was replaced then by Charles VII, that this seemingly contradictory notion is one that is housed in the idea that when one thing leaves and another comes to take its place, functionally, we have been working through predominantly this scientific pathway for some time. And what I argue here is that, as we've talked about as well, is that this is not enough. Of course, providing information and filling knowledge gaps is necessary, but it's rarely sufficient to create the kind of active and sustained behavioral engagement that's needed, that's warranted to meet the scale of these challenges around climate and environment in society in this moment in history. So again, I'll continue to move forward by talking about expanded pathways. And so we've talked about this in different ways. One of the benefits of presenting as one of the final people here is that I can refer to great insights that you've all provided, but that's also a pitfall because I might get off track. But I do want to just point out that the notion of the production of information into the public sphere that can be amplified, that can be taken up, we've talked about this, reminds me of important work in anthropology in the 1980s, Mary Douglas and Aaron Wildofsky, that's been produced and reoriented through climate change by Annabella Carvalho and Jacqueline Burgess in the 1990s at Oxford University to talk about, through these expanded pathways, it's not just simply hitting people over the head with science, it is a set of new engagements where we can express ourselves, where young people can express themselves through demonstration, through protest. Those of you who invited young people to the Vatican, this is just a more recent example of medical doctors in London, in the UK, who staged a die-in outside JP Morgan offices talking about the link to fossil fuel investments as medical professionals expanding their registers to talk about these critical challenges. And so to invoke Rush Holt, who is a respected American scientist, who was the American Association for the Advancement of Science head for some years, talks about how facts are by themselves voiceless. There is this notion of exemplification theory. We've talked about several different ways of approaching this that suggests that the concrete cases of influential actors grappling with issues like climate change, environmental change, significantly can influence citizens' awareness and inclination to act themselves. In fact, it just simply is an infectious way of approaching these things. And so that's where I take this path through climate advocacy and activism. There are many distinctions here, and I think one of the critical challenges that we've had, that we have allowed ourselves to fall into, is that there's been a conflation, that when you hear the notion of activist or advocate from science, you think about the compromising of one's rigor. You think about the ways in which someone is perhaps not fulfilling their contract with society. But so in the book and elsewhere, I've built on the work of many others to talk about the different types of advocacy. There's type 0, as I define it, just those who choose to stay away from any semblance of advocacy. And I will point out that type 1 advocacy is inaction of a sort. It's effectively a form of inaction. Secondly is type 1 advocacy these are nodes across a spectrum of engagements, advocacy for scientific evidence. And that's really what I think is pertinent for us here. Advocacy for facts, advocacy for truth is very distinct from this other node of advocacy for particular policy outcomes. So I provide for you, admittedly, some US-based personalities that have inhabited some of these spaces. Catherine Hayhoe is a longtime atmospheric scientist on the left, who, along with Neil deGrasse Tyson in the center, I've argued have taken up type 1 advocacy positions, importantly. And James Hansen, who's the third example on the right, has moved from the head of the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies in his private life into a role advocating for decarbonization and for particular policy recommendations. And so this is a way to start to at least break it down. And this social contract with society comes to the fore through the words of Jane Lubchenco, who is a former National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration administrator. She talks about how scientists need to rethink their roles and responsibilities within society in order to capably confront environmental challenges as they relate to climate change, to public health, security, social justice, and to the economy. Again, climate change is not a single issue, rather it is a set of intersecting challenges. And so the typology, and hopefully this brief quote from Jane Lubchenco can help animate the need for those of us in academic communities and elsewhere to work to provide this solid ground for researchers, particularly the next generation of researchers, as again, to return to this point that things are not the way they used to be, that those young academic researchers have been born into a world where this has been part of a public conversation since they were born. Those of us old enough and graying that can remember back to when this came onto the public agenda in the late 1980s, this is no longer the case. And so to support 21st century academic relevance, one needs to take up a 21st century perspective. This 20th century perspective, hitting people over the head with science, of removing oneself from the other registers that we have available to us for engaging with everyone, as this is a collective action problem, then sells us short. It's not just about the frequency of advocacy either, it's about effectiveness. And there's been plenty of researchers that I can point to who have been making these points and also accounting for the fact that there can be this danger of over-individualizing these issues. And that is where we can return to some earlier conversations that we have, that we can act in heroic ways as individuals within the academy, outside of it, but we need to understand the architectures, the institutions, and the histories that bring us to the places where we are now. And so there is a book that I wrote that addresses this in one of those chapters, as I mentioned. This has been a real opportunity for me at this stage of my work to be able to collect a lot of social sciences and humanities scholarship to understand in terms of communications, what is working, how, when, why, under what conditions, and integrating these lessons and putting them together into some sort of guide. Because I recognize that, you know, when I started doing this work, it's hard to believe it, but 2 decades ago, there was just the beginnings of this. And many of you have been contributing robustly and importantly to this. And so it gave me the opportunity to put this together in a book manuscript form, and making another essential point that there is no silver bullet communication strategy, that this is about silver buckshot. And that is to say that multiple approaches through the arts, through aesthetics, through public demonstrations, and a variety of ways to just get started are what are needed to move us forward. So while things aren't the way that they used to be, this is just one example of the upper ocean heat content changes in the last year, among many examples of changes. The book goes into these 10 sort of pieces of guidance, guideposts, rules of the road. And again, in the interest of time, I won't delve into each one. Authenticity has come up several times, which I think is also very important. Being aware of one's audience, being accurate, being imaginative and bold. The first 3 together, actually, I do want to take just a moment to recognize Stephen Schneider, who is a longtime climate communicator effective, who basically had talked about know thy audience, know thyself, and know thy stuff. And that's basically those first 3. It's being aware of your audience, being accurate about what you are discussing, and knowing yourself. Because I think Seema's pointed out and several others is that there are trusted messengers within these communities that have more resonance. And again, I underline this notion of here and now. No longer can we think of this as a distant threat, that we have evidence all around us, partly through our important scientific research that tells us that these are critical moments in time. So in conclusion, in trying to move us then to a discussion, I hope that that sounds acceptable at this point, is this basic question, do the responses to date match the scale of the challenges associated with 21st century climate change? The simple answer is no. Things are not what they used to be. If you're younger than 36 and a half years old, you've never experienced a cooler than average month on planet Earth. And so I can go on and on with different statistics, but stepping beyond those scientific ways of knowing, the ways in which we can engage through our humanity with these challenges can help us find that common ground and meet people where they are in order to make the necessary and significant progress that's needed. So thank you. I'll stop there.